April 12, 1945. Baguio, Philippines. 24 Japanese women knelt in the mud of a makeshift compound, their hands pressed together in prayer. They weren't praying for rescue. They were praying for death. The sky above them was the color of ash, and in the distance American voices echoed through the morning air. This was the end they'd been taught to expect. Swift, brutal, final. Before we continue with this extraordinary story, if you're finding value in these untold chapters of history, hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. Drop a comment, letting us know where you're watching from, whether it's Tokyo, Texas, or anywhere in between. Your support keeps these forgotten stories alive. The women listen to the sound of boots approaching. Heavy, purposeful American boots. Lieutenant Yoshiko closed her eyes and steadied her breathing. She'd told the others to face death with dignity as soldiers of the Emperor, but her heart hammered against her ribs. The propaganda film she'd seen flickered through her mind. American soldiers laughing as they bayonet prisoners. American soldiers setting villages ablaze. American soldiers who took no prisoners and gave no mercy. And then the footsteps stopped. The compound gate swung open, but the Americans weren't carrying rifles. They were carrying crates, food crates, medical supplies, blankets, and in that moment, kneeling in the Philippine mud, these women realized everything they'd been told was a lie. The story of these 24 Japanese women prisoners of war is one history barely remembers. No major textbooks document their names. No films dramatize their ordeal, but their experience reveals something profound about war, propaganda, and the stubborn persistence of human decency in humanity's darkest hours. What happened in that compound over the following weeks would shatter assumptions on both sides of the Pacific and prove that even in total war, compassion could survive. To understand how these women came to kneel in the mud expecting execution, we must step back 6 months earlier. In October 1944, American forces under General Douglas MacArthur returned to the Philippines, fulfilling his famous promise. The Japanese garrison, which had occupied the island since 1942, was now fighting a desperate defensive campaign. Among the 30,000 Japanese troops scattered across Luzon were approximately 200 women, nurses, communications officers, administrative clerks, and comfort station managers. Japanese military doctrine in 1944 was unambiguous about capture. The Senshenkan, the military code issued to all imperial forces, stated clearly, "Do not live to experience shame as a prisoner." Officers carried cyanide capsules. Soldiers were trained to use grenades on themselves rather than surrender. The concept of surrender was so foreign to Japanese military culture that the word itself, kozen, carried connotations of ultimate disgrace. For Japanese women in uniform, the stakes were even higher. Military propaganda had convinced them that American soldiers were barbaric savages who raped and murdered female captives without mercy. These weren't idle fears manufactured from nothing. They were deliberate, psychological constructions designed to prevent surrender and ensure soldiers fought to the death. Japanese newsreels showed staged footage of American atrocities. Radio broadcasts described invented massacres. Officers repeated these stories until they became truth. By March 1945, as American forces pushed into the mountainous Baguio region, the Japanese defensive perimeter collapsed. Most Japanese troops retreated into the mountains to wage guerrilla warfare, but approximately 24 women nurses from a field hospital, 3 communications officers, several administrative staff found themselves cut off from the main force. For 3 Weeks they hid in abandoned buildings and caves, surviving on foraged roots and contaminated water. Sergeant Macho Tanaka, 31 years old, had served as a surgical nurse in Manchuria before her deployment to the Philippines. She kept a diary, fragments of which survived the war. On March 28th, she wrote, "We have no food, no medicine. Fumo is burning. With fever. At night we hear American patrols passing nearby. Each night I think tomorrow they will find us. Tomorrow it ends." The capture came not with violence but with exhaustion. On April an American patrol discovered the women in a collapsed warehouse on the outskirts of Baguio. Private First Class Robert Chun, a Nisi soldier, serving as interpreter, was with the patrol. His account, recorded in a 1982 oral history interview, describes the scene. They were in the corner, huddled together like frightened animals. Their uniforms were torn. Some were barefoot. When they saw us, they didn't run. They just closed their eyes and started praying. I thought they were praying for mercy. Later I realized they were praying for death. The women were transported to a temporary detention compound outside the city. It wasn't a traditional P camp. American forces were advancing too rapidly to establish permanent facilities. It was simply a guarded perimeter, a few tents, a water source. The women were given a space to sleep and minimal rations, rice porridge, twice daily, occasionally supplemented with dried fish. The American guards, mostly young infantrymen from the 33rd Division, had no training in handling female prisoners. Most had never seen a Japanese woman soldier. The standing orders were simple: secure the perimeter, prevent escape, maintain basic humanitarian standards as outlined in the Geneva Convention. But standing orders said nothing about what to do when prisoners refused to eat, because they believed the food was poisoned. For the first week, the women barely touched their rations. They were convinced the Americans were fattening them before the real torture began. Nurse Fumiko Sato, 26, later recalled, through an interpreter, "We thought they were playing with us like cats with mice. We waited each day for the game to end. Malnutrition and disease spread quickly. Several women had dysentery. Fumiko's fever worsened into pneumonia. Lieutenant Yoshiko Nakamura, the highest ranking officer among them, tried to maintain military discipline, but it felt absurd. They weren't soldiers anymore. They were ghosts waiting to fade." The compound itself was a study in contrasts. Outside the wire, American supply trucks rumbled past, carrying ammunition and food to frontline units. Inside, 24 women existed in a suspended state between life and death, clinging to the only certainty they'd been taught, that Americans showed no mercy. Then came April the 12th, the day everything changed. Captain William Morrison, 34, had been a high school history teacher in Portland before the war. He'd landed at Lady Gulf in October and fought his way north through some of the bloodiest combat in the Pacific theater. He'd seen men die in ways that would haunt him forever. He'd learned to compartmentalize, to see the enemy as enemy, to do what was necessary. But when he visited the detention compound that morning as part of a routine inspection, what he saw broke through his compartmentalization. These weren't enemy soldiers. They were starving, terrified women who looked like they'd already died inside. Morrison's interpreter, Private Chun, explained the situation. The women believed they were being held for execution. They thought the meager rations were a deliberate cruelty. They expected torture. Morrison stood there in the morning sun, looking at 24 human beings who'd been so thoroughly dehumanized by their own propaganda that they couldn't recognize mercy. And he made a decision that wasn't in any Manual. He turned to his supply. Sergeant. Get me breakfast, he said. Real breakfast? Everything we've got. Within an hour, soldiers returned with crates from the division supply depot. The smell hit the compound first. Smell the women hadn't experienced in months. Fresh bread, canned meat, fruit, cocktail, coffee, chocolate bars. The American soldiers opened the crates in the center of the compound. Corporal James Rodriguez, 22, watched the women's faces. They just stared, he later wrote to his sister, like they couldn't believe what they were seeing. One of them started crying, then another, then they were all crying. I've never seen anything like it. Sergeant Micho was the first to move. She stood slowly, walked to the crates and picked up a can of corned beef. She examined it, turned it over in her hands, then looked at Captain Morrison. She said something in Japanese. Private Chun translated. She's asking if it's poisoned. Morrison took the can from her hands, opened it with his knife and ate a forkful himself. Then he handed it back. Tell her it's real, he said. Tell her. They're not going to die today. The dam broke. The women surged forward, not frantically but with careful, deliberate movements. They took food, slowly as if it might vanish. Some sat down right there and ate. Others brought food back to the sick women who couldn't stand. Private Yuki Harada, 19, the youngest of the group, picked up a chocolate bar and held it like a sacred object. She later said through an interpreter, I thought I was dreaming. Thought I had died and this was some kind of afterlife. I couldn't understand why our enemies were feeding us. But food was only the beginning. Over the next 3 days, Captain Morrison requisitioned medical supplies. An army medic examined Fumiko and started her on sulfa drugs for her pneumonia. Canvas CS replaced the muddy ground. A water purification unit provided clean drinking water. The compound transformed from a holding area into something resembling an actual pee facility. The change in the women was gradual but visible. They began eating regularly. Color returned to their faces. The constant tension that had gripped the compound began to ease, but the psychological transformation was slower and more complex. Lieutenant Yoshiko struggled with it most. She'd been trained as an officer, conditioned to lead, to maintain discipline, to uphold the emperor's honor. But what was honor when your enemy fed you? What was discipline when your own military had abandoned you? She'd spent 3 years believing Americans were monsters. Now, those monsters were treating her wounds and teaching her English words. The Americans were struggling with their own contradictions. These were enemy soldiers, Japanese soldiers, the same military that had bombed Pearl Harbor, that had committed atrocities across Asia, that had killed their friends in battles from Guadalcanal to Okinawa. Yet here they were sharing cigarettes and chocolate, teaching card games, showing photos of families back home. Corporal Rodriguez found himself in a philosophical debate with another soldier, Private Eddie Walsh. I still don't get it, Walsh said. We're supposed to kill them on the battlefield, but here we're supposed to be nice. Where's the line? Rodriguez thought about it. Maybe there isn't a line, he said. Maybe that's the point. By the end of April, something extraordinary had developed in the compound. Not quite friendship. The gulf was too wide for that. But something more significant. Recognition. Recognition that the enemy was human. Recognition that humanity persisted even when everything else failed. The Japanese women began teaching the American guards basic Japanese phrases. The Americans taught them English in return. They shared stories carefully at first, then more openly. Sergeant Mitiko, who'd been a nurse, consulted with the American medics on treating the sick women. Her medical knowledge was respected, valued. Lieutenant Yoshiko found herself discussing logistics with Captain Morrison, where to dig latrines, how to organize the sleeping area, practical matters that required no ideology, only common sense. One afternoon in early May, a sudden tropical downpour sent everyone scrambling for shelter. Private Yuki ended up under a tarp with 3 American soldiers. They sat there, watching the rain, and someone passed around a pack of Lucky Strikes. For 20 minutes they were just people sheltering from a storm. When the rain stopped, Yuki looked at the soldiers and said in halting English, "Same rain, same sky." One of the soldiers, Private Danny O'Brien, nodded. "Yeah," he said. "Same rain." It was a small moment, easily forgotten, but it represented something monumental, a crack in the absolute certainties that war demanded, a glimpse of the world as it actually was, not as propaganda painted it. The war in the Philippines was effectively over by late May. The Japanese defensive positions had collapsed. Surviving Japanese forces were scattered in the mountains, cut off from supply and command. On May 8th, Germany surrendered, though news took days to reach the remote Philippine compounds. The Pacific War continued, but everyone could sense it was entering its final phase. Captain Morrison received orders to transfer the women prisoners to a larger P facility in Manila. The compound would be dismantled. The Americans would move north. The brief, strange community that had formed would dissolve. The night before the transfer, Morrison gathered the women and explained through Private Chun what would happen. They would go to Manila. They would receive proper medical care. Eventually, when the war ended, they would be repatriated to Japan. The women listened in silence. Sergeant Micho finally spoke. Private Chun translated. "She's asking if you'll be there in Manila." Morrison shook his head. "No, my unit is moving out. Different direction." Miko nodded slowly. Then she bowed formally, deeply. The other women followed. It wasn't a gesture of submission. It was a gesture of respect, of gratitude, of recognition. Morrison, uncomfortable with the formality, returned the bow awkwardly. "You deserve to be treated like human beings," he said. "I'm glad we could do that much." The next morning, trucks arrived to transport the women to Manila. As they prepared to leave, each woman said goodbye to the soldiers they'd come to know. Lieutenant Yoshiko shook Captain Morrison's hand. "You showed us," she said in careful English, "that everything we were told was wrong." Morrison nodded. "Maybe that's the real victory," he said, learning that the enemy is just people. The women arrived in Manila on May 12th and were processed into a larger P facility, housing several hundred Japanese prisoners, both military and civilian. The facility was better equipped than the compound: barracks, a proper infirmary, organized messels. But something was lost in the transition. The intimacy of the small compound, the daily interactions that had humanized both sides, was replaced by institutional routine. The psychological aftermath surfaced slowly. Nurse Fumiko, her pneumonia cured, found herself struggling with nightmares. She dreamed she was back in the compound, but in the dreams the Americans were as monstrous as the propaganda had promised. She would wake up confused, unsure which reality was true. An army psychologist, Captain Elelainer Hayes, noted in her report, "Many female Japanese PS exhibit symptoms of severe cognitive dissonance. Their experience contradicts everything their military training conditioned them to believe." Lieutenant Yoshiko faced a different crisis: identity. She'd defined herself as an officer of the Imperial Army, but what did that mean now? Her army had abandoned her. Her country was losing. The enemy had shown more honor than her own commanders. She spent hours in the facility's small library reading whatever books were available in Japanese, trying to reconstruct a sense of self. Private Yuki, the youngest, adapted most easily. She was barely out of girlhood, less conditioned by military indoctrination. She befriended some of the civilian women prisoners, learned more English, even started teaching Japanese to some of the American nurses at the facility. She was building something new from the ruins of what had been. On August 15, 1945, Emperor Hirohito's voice crackled over the radio announcing Japan's surrender. The war was over. In the Manila P facility, the news brought relief, grief, and confusion. For many, surrender was unthinkable. Some refused to believe it. Others wept openly. Sergeant Micho stood listening, tears streaming, though she wasn't sure why. Defeat, relief, or lost years. She thought of Captain Morrison and the Americans who'd fed her when she expected death. They'd won more than the war. They'd proven that even in chaos, humanity could survive. Repatriation took months. The women from the Baguio compound waited in Manila, writing letters home, unsure what truths they could share. In November, they were placed on a U.S. Navy transport bound for Japan. As Lieutenant Yoshiko boarded, Captain Hayes asked, "What will you tell people?" "I'll tell them," she said, "that the enemy taught me more about honor than my own commanders did." 12 days later, they docked at Uraga Harbor. Japan lay in ruins, cities burned, people starving, hope thin. Returning home was harder than captivity. Micho found her Hiroshima village half destroyed, but her family alive. Her mother urged silence about the war, but Micho couldn't stay silent. She worked in a clinic telling patients about the American who'd brought breakfast. Some doubted her. One old doctor said, "Maybe that's how we rebuild, not with weapons, but with empathy." Yoshiko reunited with her husband, a naval officer. Their first conversations were painful. He'd fought Americans while she'd learned to see them as people. Slowly they found common ground in exhaustion and the desire for peace. Private Yuki, only 20, struggled most. She'd known only war, yet she found purpose teaching English. In Yokohama, when students asked where she'd learned it, she said, "From the enemy. They taught me that enemies can become teachers." In 1947, 15 of the 24 women reunited in Tokyo. Over a modest meal, they toasted survival. Yoshiko said, "To survival." Fumiko, the nurse, added, "To the men who showed us that survival could be honorable." Yuki whispered, "To second chances," and Miko said simply, "To remembering, so we never forget what humanity looks like even in war." The reunions dwindled over time. In 1982, historian Thomas Nakamura interviewed Michiko, now 73. She showed her diary. "The Americans brought us food. How do we make sense of enemies who feed us?" She said, "The worst lies make us see others as less than human." Captain Morrison remembered simply, "We gave them breakfast instead. No medals, no headlines, only a stone in Tokyo."